Tvet in Kenya during colonization by Dr. Paul Wanyeki. Welcome to our today's lecture. Kenya has a long and rich history of education and training. In this lecture, we are going to look at Tvet in Kenya from 1885 to 1910. This is during the first 25 years of the colonial administration. This was a very painful period as firstly, the white man had a complete misinformation of who a black man is. And secondly, he championed an education system that sought to serve his needs and interests only. Thirdly, the education system was fashioned to block the Africans from enlightenment. That is brought by the literate education.
Expected learning outcomes. By the end of this lecture, we should be able to 1. To discuss history of Tvet between 1885 to 1910. 2. Analyze the impact of various colonial policy and commissions to education development in the country. It is important to learn about this knowledge since it provides information about the foundations of education in Kenya. The knowledge that we will receive from this lesson will enable us explain origin of some policies in Kenya, foundations of some behavior, culture in Kenya, contribution of individuals, church, and better still, understand the mistakes that were made while implementing education policies in Kenya during the colonial era. In our last lecture, I left you to reflect on a quote that was supposedly written by Venerable Thomas Babington Macaulay. These statements were recorded on February 2nd, 1835. It goes as follows. I have traveled across the length and breadth of Africa, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of this caliber that I do not think we will ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage, and therefore I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if the African think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. The lessons that we learn from Thomas' statements are that Africa had a working education system that had achieved the following. The African education system had produced an equal society. Everybody in the African society was wealthy and we had no beggars. The education system had equally produced moral and just society. He found no prison. He found no thief. And lastly, the African education system had produced spiritual and rich cultural heritage. People were spiritual and moral, upright. Thomas had a proposal. And the proposal was that we replace the ancient education system. And secondly, the rich African culture and heritage was to replace. Reasons for the replacement are as follows. To make Africans think that all is foreign and English is good and greater than what is African. The second reason for replacement of the traditional African education system was to make Africans lose their self-esteem. Also, to make Africans lose their native culture. And therefore, Africans will become dependent and a truly dominated nation. Early colonial education in Kenya. The decision to build the Kenya-Uganda Railway necessitated the need of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled labor. Education at that time was managed by different fractions, and it was guided by different needs. One was the requirement of the technical labor, and it was divided into three: management or skilled labor, unskilled labor, and the semi-skilled labor. Management and technical labor was to be provided by whites, and it comprised whites with a background in engineering, project management, and any other relevant skills. Majority were holders of diplomas and bachelor's degree in their respective specialty that were earned from their country, which is Britain. These were the people who were managing the light industry and construction of the Kenya-Uganda railway. Also, we had skilled labor during construction of the Uganda-Kenyan railway, and skilled labor was provided by the Indians, who were technologists, technicians, and master crafts person. Most of them had a diploma, craft certificate, or on-job training. The Indian labor was imported, and somehow the colonial administration found it to be a little bit expensive. Also, there was need to have semi-skilled and unskilled labor, and this labor of semi-skilled labor and unskilled was provided by the natives. These are the Africans. This comprised of artisans and manual laborers. The qualification was to have artisan training and symbol reading, writing, and arithmetic competencies. So these are the forces that pushed the colonial administration to establish industrial and vocational schools for the Africans in Kenya. Education system in 1900 to 1910. The following guided the nature of education system during the mentioned period. One was labor for the railway construction. At this time, as I had mentioned before, the colonial administration was finding that the labor provided by the Indians was a little bit expensive and also insufficient, because in terms of unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor, it required a lot of human resource, and there was plenty from the native. Therefore, labor for railway construction pushed the need of establishing formal education in Kenya. Also, labor for settlers' agricultural farms. The settlers who came in Kenya were mostly practicing large-scale agriculture. They needed people who could do plant husbandry and animal husbandry. And they needed people who could also take instructions and had some knowledge of recording down data. Therefore, they needed people who could read, write, and do simple arithmetic, and at the same time take care of the farms. Also, light industries that were being established, they needed technical people to work on them. And settlers also needed to settle in houses and furniture. Therefore, they needed masonries to produce or to build for them their houses. And also, they needed carpenters and plumbers to do the plumbing jobs and the furniture jobs for the settlers who were settling in Kenya. The missionaries needed people to assist in evangelization. Also, this pushed the need for education system in Kenya. The missionaries needed people who could assist them in translating the Bible to local languages. Also, they needed the people who could assist in spreading the gospel. Therefore, there was need to train the catechist in reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Settlers also there was need of a disempowered labor force. The settlers needed cheap labor. Therefore, this informed the education system of the time that they were to provide an education system that will not produce quality people, will not produce people with high expertise, but people who can accept a small payment because they lack the expertise and they cannot work on their own. They work under supervision. Also, colonial administration needed native administrators. They needed collaborators who were African so that they can use them to pass the message to the local and also to govern the local, and also to show the local that they are collaborating with fellow Africans, and the locals will be learning from the collaborators who are native administrators who have been given basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. Management of education. During this era, education for Africans was solely left to the missionaries. The government played almost to no role in management and financing of the African education. Missionary education in the country was linked to conversion of Africans to Christianity and little on literate education. In fact, there is evidence that up to about 1918, 1920, missionaries who were from the Roman Catholic faith did not favor reading, because in most of their doctrine at that time, Christians were not to read the Bible for themselves, but the Bible was to read to them by the priests or the clergy. Therefore, by that time, in their school, they offered little reading and writing. The missionary school taught students general rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and as I've mentioned, to a very less extent. Justification of missionary education system. The missionary system designed their African education system based on a study of cranial capacity of African that were done by the colonialist. Needless to say that the study was inspired by racial debate concerning the educability of African, and thus it was biased and unscientific. The study unfortunately concluded as follows: that Africans were not educable. Africans' intellect was undeveloped. Also, it concluded that African education should proceed by the training of the eye, ear, and mind, since the African intellect was underdeveloped. Also, the study recommended that thought must evolve by means of oral or written composition and expression of form and number out of the work created by his own effort, as this will lead to the development of the motor center of the African brain. Actually, sadly to report that the study concluded that an adult African had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old white kid. That was unfortunate. Let us look at the contribution of Charles Elliot to education in Kenya during that period. Charles Elliot was the governor of Kenya by that time, and during that time he was the governor in the early 1900s, and the settlers were just settling, and the settlers demanded for education for their children. And they demanded this through their governor, who was Charles Elliot. Let us see what Charles Elliot did. He listened to them, and in 1902, a school for European children was opened. Remember, during this time, education was offered in racial lines. Europeans had their own education system and their own curriculum and their own schools. Indians and people of Asian origin had their own education system, their own curriculum, and their own schools. And also, the Africans had their own curriculum and their own schools. In 1903, the governor encouraged more white settlers to settle in the colony. Therefore, this meant that the population of white settlers increased, and therefore there was need of establishing more schools for the white kids and also getting more qualified teachers to teach the white kids. A few years later, in 1910, a school for the Asian children was opened. You can see now the gap, meaning before that, the Asian kids were not getting a formal education that was provided by the government. If there was any, it was one that was organized at community level as Asian community. By 1910, there were 35 mission schools. And now these ones were the ones serving the entire African population. Also, education was offered on racial lines. Europeans, Indians, and Africans attended different schools, taking different curriculums. They were funded differently. European education was the highly funded education, followed by Indians, and African education was the worst funded. Also, in terms of curriculum scope, European curriculum offered literate education, Indian curriculum combined literate and technical education, and African curriculum concentrated on vocational and agricultural education only. By the year 1909, the British government sponsored study of education in the East African Protectorate. At least now we are seeing the government coming in 1909 and sponsoring the study of education in the East African Protectorate. By this time, they started by sponsoring the European education and then later the Indian education and lastly the African education. To that point, it marks the end of our lesson today, and in our next lesson, we'll be looking at the Fraser Commission of 1908, this being the first commission that was established by the British government, and this was after the European had complained about the quality of education that was being offered to their kids. And at the same time, the Africans were complaining due to lack of education facilities and also the poor quality of education that they were receiving.
Thank you. Looking forward to meet you in the next lecture.